Hi there, thanks so much for joining me, and we're going to continue talking about economics, and we're going to look at some definitions. So the first definition that we're going to look at is capitalism. Now, capitalism, generally speaking, gets a bad press. It is always portrayed very negatively, and we're constantly being told that we need to end capitalism. But what is capitalism? So I'm going to read you a definition that I googled, and it says an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit. And then a second bit of definition: the means of production are held by private individuals or organisations and not the government. Now, I personally would add a little bit to that. So capitalism is the ability to capitalise on the things that you already have. So that is things like time, skill, and then actual physical things. So that means being able to build, being able to serve, being able to use what means you have to serve other people, and yes, to make profit. Now, profit is not a dirty word, okay? And I'm going to explain that further. But essentially it means that how things are built, how things are made, are owned by private individuals, okay? Now, the reason why people think that is bad is because they think that means corporatism. They think of big business, they think that the little man is put out of business by bigger industries. Okay, that's not really right, and I'll come back to why in a moment. So my next definition is communism. And believe it or not, communism, like capitalism, is a financial system. So a communist society would entail the absence of private property and the absence of social classes, and ultimately money and the state. Now, I'm going to interrupt, that's not the end of the definition, but in every communist society that there's ever been, they have never got rid of the state. And in actual fact, the opposite has been true. The state has become bigger and bigger and more powerful, sucking up more and more of the nation's wealth. Communists often seek a voluntary state of self-governance, but disagree on the means to this end. Now, a voluntary state of self-governance actually is more like capitalism, because in capitalism, everything is voluntary. There is no state coercion at all. So I think that is a little bit of a misleading definition, because a communist society is completely controlled by the state. In theory, the long-term aim is to get rid of the state, but in reality, when it says the absence of private property is owned by the state. Everything is owned by the state. All businesses are owned by the state. Everything that you own is owned by the state. That's what communism is. In theory, it's supposed to be about everything being shared equally. But in practice, it leads to a massive amount of wealth stored in a very small number of people at the top, and then the rest of the nation being exceedingly poor. In practice, that is always how it has worked out, and it has led to people dying of starvation in communist China, in Soviet Russia, and in fact the whole of the Soviet Union. Millions died of starvation because of communism. Okay. Fascism. Now, this is a word that is bandied around all the time, and I'm going to be honest, I found finding a succinct definition really difficult, and lots of people said, oh, well, nobody really knows the definition, it's like nailing jelly to a wall, was literally what I read. But they all used the word totalitarian. So fascism is a totalitarian system. Now, I'm going to give you my understanding of fascism because it's very similar to communism. And this is my understanding from Mussolini's definition, and Mussolini was the first fascist. He was the creator of fascism. He probably wasn't. Probably hundreds of years before that, there have been systems very like this around the world. We have this idea that everything around us is somehow new. It's not. There's nothing new under the sun. People have organised themselves in different ways, very similar to this, for thousands of years. So, fascism, in my understanding, is that the means of production is sometimes owned privately and sometimes owned by the state. But either way, businesses are very highly regulated and only really have government contracts. That is, they can only make what the government allows them to make. And on this definition, I would argue that Britain is very close to a fascist monetary system. And I'll give you an example of what is fascist. So if you remember back to 2008 when we had the banking crisis, our beloved government used our tax money to bail out banks. So that is money. Incidentally, the government doesn't have any money. You should know that. The government doesn't have any money. It only has our money. So when it takes money and gives it to foreign aid, to war, whatever, that is your money that they're taking from you in order to do that. Well, partly it's that, partly it's the old quantitative easing. But ultimately, the bailing out of businesses using tax money, that is fascist. And here's the thing, I'm going to tell you another story about the bailing out of the banks. So in Britain, all the banks were in trouble during that period in 2008 when the banks collapsed, except for one bank, a bank called the Airdrie Savings Bank. You could argue that that was the only honest bank in Britain because it did not get itself involved in the practices that led to the financial crisis in 2008. It wasn't involved, and therefore it didn't have any problems and it didn't need to be bailed out. Okay, now, after the banking crisis, the government introduced banking regulations that were supposed to stop whatever practices had been going on that led to that crisis. The idea being, we'll never have a crisis like that again. So all the banks had to follow extremely tight regulations after that. And do you want to know what happened to the Airdrie Savings Bank? It couldn't implement those regulations. They were too onerous. So it was regulated out of business. The only honest bank in Britain. And it couldn't survive. It survived the crash. What it couldn't survive was the regulations. Now that too is a form of fascism, when government regulations mean that honest businesses can't compete. So, you know what happened? All the dishonest businesses carried on, and the one honest business couldn't survive. That is very fascistic. Okay, let's look now at communism. And communism also... Oh, sorry, we've done communism. Let's look now at socialism. So I'm going to read... Socialism gets a much more positive press, probably of all the economic theories. Socialism is the one that's probably held in people's hearts best. So this is the definition: a political and economic theory of social organisation which advocates the means of production, distribution and exchange should be owned or regulated by the community as a whole. Now that is almost exactly the same as communism. The community owns all the businesses. And of course, the reality is that means the state. Because, you know, we're not getting rid of the state anytime soon. Or ever. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Okay, then there's a second Marxist theory, which is a transitional social state between the overthrow of capitalism and the realisation of communism. So you could argue then we live in a socialist state because we're partway between capitalism and communism. How do I know we're partway? Well, there's lots of businesses that are privately owned. There are plenty of cafes, restaurants, shops, although fewer shops, that are small businesses owned by local people that you can go into. You can give your money to these small businesses. And then there are much bigger corporate entities. And I'm going to say that when you see the big corporate entities, that's much closer to fascism, because a lot of these big multinationals have unhealthy relationships with the state. And that is problematic. And another thing that we saw during lockdown was the close of small businesses. Okay, so if you remember, we had gyms being shut down. A lot of gyms owned by small businesses, owned by individual people. And we saw McDonald's being kept open. And this was supposed to be a health crisis that encouraged unhealthy eating and discouraged exercise. Really? And what we also saw, a lot of small shops, privately owned, closing down. And I've heard it said, I don't know if this is true, that the lockdown caused the biggest ever transfer of wealth from poor to rich. Now that is not capitalism, by the way. That is fascism, communism, because it's going from the individual, the small producer, to a big corporate body that we don't know, into the blob. We don't know where that money's gone. So that's the situation that we're in. We're going to talk a little bit next time about what we can do, how we can get ourselves out of this mess. But that's all for just now. So thanks very much for joining me. Bye.